Dawn breaks over Leyte Gulf. October 1944. The sky is bruised purple, the sea slick with oil and smoke. From the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M0, Lieutenant Satoru Okada scans the horizon. His fuel gauge trembles. Below, the jungle breathes mist over shattered palms, and the thin veins of dirt roads carved by recent rain. He expects silence. He expects retreat. Instead, he hears engines. Not the rising whine of Japanese Nakajima fighters, but a deeper, unfamiliar thunder. The twin rumble of American Pratt & Whitney radials. Through the haze, Okada blinks. Down there, on what appears to be nothing more than a narrow provincial road, half choked with mud, strewn with wreckage, silver aircraft are landing. P-38 Lightnings, their twin booms glinting in the morning sun. Behind them, B-25 Mitchell bombers lumber down the same strip, kicking up a storm of dust and debris. He cannot believe what he's seeing. Those roads were bombed the previous week. They weren't airfields. They were supply lanes, barely wide enough for trucks. Yet the Americans are using them. One Lightning skids sideways, correcting with a burst of power. Another lifts off from the same stretch minutes later, its propellers flashing like knives. The sequence is fluid, practiced, impossible. To Okada's eye, it breaks every rule of air doctrine Japan had drilled into its pilots for years. Airfields required preparation, grading, drainage, concrete, precision. This was madness, but it worked. Below him, U.S. Army engineers, the 850th Aviation Engineer Battalion, guided by the legendary Seabees, swarm over the rough terrain. They've laid pierced steel planking across the mud, creating instant runways out of farm roads and jungle clearings. Bulldozers roar between palm trunks. Men with picks and shovels move like clockwork. Within hours of securing the beachhead, they have created operational airstrips, foxhole fields, as the Americans call them, capable of launching fighters, delivering supplies, and evacuating wounded men. Okada's radio crackles. His squadron leader's voice is strained, disbelieving. "Impossible," he mutters. "Those airstrips were destroyed. The Americans, they're already flying from them." High above the chaos, Okada banks his Zero toward the rising sun. He's outnumbered, outfueled, and outthought. For the first time, he feels it. A cold certainty sinking into his gut. The war is shifting, not by heroism or sheer will, but by something else entirely: ingenuity. As he retreats into the clouds, the roads below shimmer with metallic life. An army that turns mud into steel, rain into runway, and retreat into relentless advance. In that moment, Japanese pilots realized the truth. The Americans had learned to land anywhere, and that meant they could fight anywhere. Fade to black. Title appears over archival footage. Makeshift roads, the American airfields that shocked Japan. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had become a contest of endurance. Japan's empire still stretched across thousands of islands, from the Dutch East Indies to the Philippines. But its power was bleeding out, mile by mile, ton by ton. Every Japanese pilot in the sky that year was flying with ghosts behind him. Fuel shortages, crippled logistics, and shattered communications had begun to eat through the once fierce imperial air arm. Yet, from Tokyo to Truk, one conviction remained unshaken. The Americans could not move fast enough. That belief had shaped Japanese planning since the beginning. For 3 years, they had built their defenses around geography, around the ocean itself. If they lost one island, they'd fortify the next. If an airfield fell, another stood ready, carved deep into jungle or coral. They expected every Allied invasion to take weeks before aircraft could operate from newly captured ground. Weeks to drain, to pave, to prepare. In those weeks, Japan's Zeros could strike, bomb, and bleed the enemy before the next leap forward. But in 1944, something changed. The Americans no longer moved like a single army. They moved like a machine. Under General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, the United States had fused naval and air power with a new weapon: engineering. The Naval Construction Battalions, known simply as the Seabees, and the U.S. Army's Aviation Engineer Battalions had learned to build airfields faster than Japan could destroy them. They carried steel mats, bulldozers, and dynamite aboard the very ships that invaded. Within hours of hitting a beach, they could level ground, drive down steel planking, and turn a coconut grove into an operational base. This changed everything. The innovation was simple, yet revolutionary: pierced steel planking, or PSP. Each section weighed about 66 pounds, interlocking like armor plates. It could turn swampland into runway almost overnight. When laid over crushed coral or compacted dirt, PSP could handle the weight of heavy bombers, even in the rain-soaked tropics. By the time of the Philippines campaign, the Americans were not just invading, they were building as they fought. October 20th, 1944. MacArthur's Sixth Army stormed the beaches of Leyte, the first step toward reclaiming the archipelago. Japanese defenders had expected a drawn-out fight before the Americans could even think of landing aircraft. Instead, within 72 hours, U.S. engineers were landing P-38s and B-25s on temporary strips. The shock was immediate. Japanese reconnaissance pilots reported enemy aircraft operating from destroyed roads and open fields. Tokyo dismissed it as propaganda, but soon entire formations of American bombers were flying from places that didn't exist on any pre-war map. The Americans had achieved what the Imperial Army considered impossible: mobility without infrastructure. They didn't need months of preparation, concrete, or complex logistics. They needed dirt, steel, and willpower. It wasn't just engineering genius. It was strategic adaptation. For years, the Japanese military had treated air bases as sacred, fixed assets, carefully graded, meticulously maintained, and vulnerable. The Americans treated them as disposable. If one was bombed, they'd build another. If the ground was soft, they hardened it with steel. The result was a logistical rhythm Japan couldn't match. Each captured island became a springboard for the next, from the Marianas to Palau, from Morotai to Leyte. Every new airstrip extended the reach of American bombers, shortening supply lines, tightening the noose around Japan's empire. By late 1944, American air power was no longer limited by geography. It was limited only by imagination and steel. The war was no longer about who held the most islands, but who could use them fastest. And that race between speed and stubbornness was about to decide the fate of the Pacific. In Tokyo's war rooms, the Japanese High Command still believed in fixed power: fortresses, fleets, and airfields that would stand like anchors against the tide. Their air doctrine, born in the 1930s, had been built on permanence. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Force operated from carefully selected bases, many carved into coral atolls or volcanic ridges. They were symbols of order, each with its fuel depots, workshops, and hardened revetments. Every pilot trained to return to a known place, a strip that was marked, measured, and safe. Mobility, in the Japanese mindset, was a naval affair, not an aerial one. Ships could move. Airfields could not. To suggest that aircraft might launch and land from improvised ground seemed reckless, even dishonorable, unworthy of the precision expected from the Emperor's airmen. So, as the war deepened, Japan's leaders continued to plan for a slow Allied approach. They believed time itself was their weapon, that each mile of ocean, each tropical storm, each crumbling port would grind down the invaders. But across the Pacific, another mind saw time differently. Douglas MacArthur. He had promised to return to the Philippines, and when he spoke, his engineers listened as if it were an order carved in stone. MacArthur's genius was not only in strategy, but in understanding the power of movement. He saw that victory depended on speed, on never allowing Japan to recover between blows. To make that possible, he needed air support, not from distant carriers, but from fields close enough to strike and return in hours. That demand fell to men without glory, the engineers. While infantry and air crews earned headlines, the engineers fought their own war in mud, heat, and rain. The Seabees, the aviation engineer battalions, they worked while artillery still thundered, laying steel planking under fire. For them, enemy territory began the moment the first bulldozer touched sand. The 850th, 864th, and 866th Engineer Battalions became legends in this hidden war. They could turn a wrecked plantation into a runway in 48 hours. Their unofficial motto, "The difficult we do now, the impossible takes a little longer." To the Japanese, it was inconceivable. On October 23, 1944, just 3 days after the initial landings on Leyte, American P-38s of the 475th Fighter Group took off from a strip the Japanese believed destroyed. They roared over Ormoc Bay, intercepting incoming Zeros that expected an empty sky. The surprise was total. For pilots like Lieutenant Okada, it felt like a law of nature had been broken. Airfields were supposed to take weeks to repair, not hours. Yet here were the Americans, landing and refueling on stretches of road still littered with shell fragments. To the Japanese command, reports of enemy aircraft operating from damaged or non-existent fields sounded like exaggeration or deception, but reconnaissance confirmed it. The Americans had developed a new kind of warfare, engineering as strategy. Meanwhile, Japan's air groups were trapped in a collapsing supply chain. Fuel had to cross seas patrolled by American submarines. Replacement aircraft were arriving slower than they were being shot down. By the time of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, Japanese air power was already dying not from combat, but from starvation. In the Philippines, the contrast could not have been sharper. Where Japanese airmen waited for supplies that never came, the Americans built their own logistics on the move. If fuel was low, they laid new pipelines. If roads collapsed, they made new ones. If an airfield flooded, they laid down steel. By the end of 1944, American pilots were flying from places the Japanese hadn't even finished mapping. And in every one of those improvised bases, a new reality took shape. That war was no longer won by fortification, but by flexibility. The age of static defense, of fortified islands and fixed runways, was ending, and the empire that had once mastered the Pacific skies was about to discover what it meant to fight an enemy who could land anywhere and build everywhere. Before the first American ship approached Leyte, Japan already had its defense written in doctrine. They called it Operation Show 1, the Victory Operation. It was meant to be a grand counterstroke, the decisive stand that would halt the American advance and restore Japan's shrinking sphere of control. The plan was bold, elegant, and, on paper, perfect. When the United States landed in the central Philippines, Japan would unleash its remaining fleet in a three-pronged assault. From the north, Admiral Ozawa's carrier decoys would lure away the American Third Fleet. From the west, Admiral Kurita's massive center force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, would steam through the Sibuyan Sea to crush the invasion fleet. From the south, Nishimura and Shima's battleships and cruisers would strike Leyte Gulf from behind. Above it all, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service was to provide the shield, based on airfields across the Philippines: Clark, Nichols, and Tacloban. These bases were the foundation of the plan. They would refuel, rearm, and repair the fighters that would keep the American landings under siege. But this vision depended on one assumption: that the Americans would need weeks to make their captured beaches usable for air operations. In the eyes of Japan's planners, time was the decisive factor. If their air groups could strike first, before U.S. aircraft could operate locally, they could cripple the invasion. That narrow window of days or weeks was the heart of Show 1. But reality never gave them that window. When the landings began on October 20th, the Americans brought not only soldiers and tanks, they brought entire airfields in boxes. Each landing ship, tank, LST, carried tons of steel matting, bulldozers, graders, and fuel drums. Within hours of securing the beaches, the Seabees and the Army engineers were already transforming the mud into airstrips. By the second day, engineers had laid more than 2,000 feet of pierced steel planking on Tacloban's shoreline. By the third, P-38 Lightnings were taking off from it. The Japanese had expected to dominate the skies for 2 weeks. They had barely 2 days. This single miscalculation shattered the rhythm of Japan's defense. Their air forces, scattered across Luzon and Mindanao, could not redeploy fast enough. The communication lines were chaotic. Weather grounded half the planned sorties. Fuel convoys from Borneo never arrived, torpedoed by American submarines before reaching the archipelago. In desperation, Japanese commanders ordered what planes remained to strike the beachheads directly. On October 24th, bombers from Clark and Nichols fields launched desperate attacks on the American landing zones. They found not an exposed beach, but an expanding fortress, with anti-aircraft guns, radar stations, and fighter patrols already in the air. Most of the Japanese bombers never returned. Their airfields, once the backbone of Japan's defensive plan, were themselves under attack from aircraft that had landed just the day before on makeshift steel. For the first time in the war, the Japanese High Command faced a form of warfare they had not imagined: an enemy who erased the delay between invasion and air supremacy. From Tokyo's perspective, the reports made no sense. How could the Americans already be flying from Leyte? How could aircraft be operating from roads that weren't even built for trucks? And yet every intercepted signal, every reconnaissance flight confirmed it. The American advance had fused engineering, logistics, and combat into one continuous motion, something no Japanese planner had accounted for. Operation Show 1 had been built on the assumption that geography would slow the Americans. Instead, it was geography, the same mountains, swamps, and jungles that Japan could no longer defend fast enough. The Empire's plans, perfect in theory, were disintegrating in mud, rain, and the metallic rhythm of bulldozers. By late October 1944, the Philippines were no longer following any plan, at least not Japan's. What had begun as a calculated defense dissolved into confusion. Storms rolled over Leyte like an omen. Torrential rain turned rice paddies into rivers, soaked ammunition, and grounded aircraft. For Japanese commanders, it was the perfect ally. Mud was supposed to paralyze mechanized warfare. But once again, the Americans refused to wait. Their engineers drove bulldozers through the storm. They drained fields, compacted dirt with tank treads, and laid steel planking across the mud like armor. Lightning strikes flashed over the jungle while men worked knee-deep in water, hammering each sheet of metal into place. The rain that halted movement for one side became a proving ground for the other. When Japanese spotters reported American aircraft taking off from rain-flooded ground, their commanders thought it impossible. Even Japanese pilots, trained to respect the precision of airfields, could hardly believe it. For them, flying was an art of perfection. Every takeoff and landing required ritual precision. Runways leveled to fractions of an inch, drainage trenches dug by hand, surfaces rolled smooth by steamrollers. Their aircraft, light, agile, and delicate, demanded it. A misplaced stone could tear open the belly of a Zero or shatter its landing gear. But the Americans had built machines for imperfection. The P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the rugged B-25 Mitchell. Each could handle punishment that would destroy a Japanese fighter. Thick landing gear, wide tires, and reinforced wings made them ideal for rough strips. The Americans didn't just adapt their airfields to the jungle. They had designed their aircraft for the kind of war they intended to fight. Mobile, improvised, relentless. In contrast, Japanese aircraft design still served the ideals of the 1930s: lightweight, range, and agility over resilience. The Zero was a dancer, not a workhorse. It could soar gracefully, but it could not land on a dirt road soaked with rain. By early November, Japan's chain of command was breaking under the weight of its own rigidity. At Clark Field, the once proud air hub of the Philippines, maintenance crews worked without spare parts. Mechanics stripped wrecks to keep surviving planes in the air. Fuel was rationed to the last liter. Pilots were ordered to save ammunition by engaging only when certain of a kill. Meanwhile, the Americans turned every captured road, farm, and stretch of beach into a launch pad. At Dulag, at Tacloban, at Burauen, makeshift strips sprang up faster than Japanese intelligence could locate them. Each one brought new waves of fighters and bombers into the sky. The Japanese plan had counted on delay. Delay would buy them time to bring reinforcements from Formosa, to regroup their fleet, to strike back with coordinated air-sea power. But there was no delay. In a single month, the Americans expanded from beachheads to fully functional air bases, linked by supply lines that ran both over sea and through the very roads they'd turned into runways. For the Imperial Army and Navy, coordination became impossible. Messages arrived too late. Units acted in isolation. One commander on Luzon complained bitterly that, "By the time we prepare to attack, the enemy has already built another airfield." In war, speed is not only measured in miles per hour, but in days gained or lost. Japan had lost weeks in the span of days. When the last phase of Operation Show 1 collapsed in late October, when Kurita's fleet turned back after losing Musashi, it wasn't only a naval defeat. It was the final proof that Japan's entire defensive structure could no longer keep pace with American improvisation. The plan that was supposed to reclaim the initiative had instead revealed the truth: that America's greatest weapon was not just the bomb, nor the ship, nor the plane. It was the ability to adapt faster than anyone else could understand. October 24th, 1944. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of metal and a landscape soaked in war. On Leyte's eastern coast, the new American foothold still smelled of salt, oil, and rain-soaked earth. Men worked without rest. Their mission: turn chaos into order before nightfall. The 850th and 864th Engineer Aviation Battalions had arrived with bulldozers, graders, and steel planking stacked like armor plates. The Japanese air raids had not stopped. Every hour, Zeros screamed down from the clouds, strafing the coastline. But the engineers didn't flinch. They didn't fight with guns. They fought with time. By noon, the engineers had cleared 3,000 feet of rough ground just beyond the Tacloban shoreline. They laid down pierced steel planking, locking each section by hand. The ground was still wet, and every step clanged like thunder. Mud splashed their faces, bullets snapped overhead, but the rhythm never stopped. At 3:40 p.m., a small crowd of soldiers and officers gathered near the edge of the new strip. A radio operator called out across the field, "Lightning inbound!" "Repeat, lightning inbound!" The men looked up. Out of the distant haze came the first American aircraft to land on Philippine soil since 1942, a P-38 of the 475th Fighter Group. It dropped fast, skimming the treetops, engines roaring as it aligned with the barely finished runway. Wheels struck steel. Sparks flew. For a moment, it seemed the fighter would slide off the edge into the marsh. But it held. It rolled to a stop as soldiers cheered, their voices drowned by the echoing engines. That sound, the thrum of propellers on makeshift steel, was more than a landing. It was a declaration. Within minutes, more lightnings appeared, circling down one after another. Fuel trucks, really converted jeeps dragging barrels, rushed forward. Ground crews rearmed, refueled, and sent them back into the air. By sundown, American fighters were intercepting Japanese bombers over Leyte Gulf, aircraft that had taken off from this very strip less than an hour earlier. For the Japanese, the effect was devastating. Reconnaissance pilots reported enemy aircraft taking off from non-airfield areas. The Imperial General Headquarters refused to believe it until captured radio intercepts confirmed the impossible. Japan's intelligence. Officers began mapping what they called temporary American airfields, but by the time they finished marking one, another had already appeared. The speed of these operations became surreal. At Duleg, engineers built a second airstrip in less than 72 hours, cutting through a mangrove swamp with flamethrowers and tractors. At Burauen, a third strip rose where only jungle and rice paddies had stood. Each was functional, crude, and alive. Proof that the Americans had turned the very terrain against its defenders. To the pilots who landed there, these fields looked like miracles stitched together from mud and steel. P-47. Thunderbolts thundered in with their landing flaps trembling, skimming over stumps and wreckage. B-25s touched down heavy with fuel and bombs, their tires sinking inches into the soft ground before clawing free. Every landing was a gamble, every takeoff a defiance of physics, and yet they worked. The Japanese struck back with everything they could. Bombers attacked Tacloban and Dulag in waves. Kamikaze raids began, desperate, chaotic, and increasingly frequent. Each time the engineers rushed back to the field the moment the last explosion faded, patching holes, replacing planks, and clearing debris. One eyewitness from the 850th Battalion later recalled, "We worked in shifts, 12 hours, 16 hours, sometimes without food. If a bomb hit, we fixed it. If the strip flooded, we pumped it dry. The pilots said they'd land no matter what, so we made sure they could." By the end of October, more than 150 American aircraft were operating daily from Leyte. They flew reconnaissance, bombing runs, and close support for infantry locked in jungle combat. Every sortie shortened Japan's reach, and every returning aircraft carried the same unspoken message. The skies now belonged to the engineers as much as the pilots. In Tokyo, the psychological impact was immediate. Interrogated after the war, several Japanese officers admitted that they could not comprehend how the Americans had restored full air operations so quickly. Their own engineers would have taken weeks, perhaps months, to do what the Americans accomplished in days. It was not merely speed, it was an entirely new philosophy of war. The Americans didn't wait for perfect conditions. They created them. They didn't rebuild the battlefield. They reshaped it. As one U.S. officer described it, "We no longer captured airfields. We built our own." By the first week of November, the air over Leyte belonged to the United States. From these improvised runways, fighters struck Japanese convoys, bombed enemy positions inland, and shielded advancing infantry. Every mission began and ended on ground that, a week earlier, had been nothing but mud and wreckage. The Japanese had believed that terrain and time would protect them, but both had betrayed them. For every crater they left, the Americans filled it. For every destroyed strip, a new one appeared. And from every one of those strips, another wave of aircraft rose. Faster, heavier, closer than before. The Pacific, once ruled by the imperial rising sun, now echoed with the thunder of engines landing on roads not meant for planes. The age of improvisation had begun. By November 1944, Leyte had become more than a battlefield. It was a laboratory of invention. Everywhere, the sound of engines mixed with the clatter of steel planking. The lines between combat and construction blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The American engineers had become as vital as any division of infantry. They slept beside the runways they built, sometimes in foxholes half filled with water. At dawn, they cleared the night's debris, twisted metal, shattered palms, unexploded shells. By noon, the strip would hum again, alive with the sound of warplanes rising into the heavy tropical air. Each new field became a front. When Japanese artillery began shelling the Tacloban runway, the Americans simply shifted operations to Burauen. When Burauen flooded, they drained it and began laying a new strip nearby, nicknamed Hill Field. The Japanese couldn't destroy what never stayed still. From these makeshift runways, U.S. pilots launched an unbroken campaign of air dominance. P-38s and P-47s swept over the skies of Leyte and Samar, intercepting enemy bombers before they reached the coast. B-25 Mitchells hunted Japanese shipping in Ormoc Bay, their low-level attacks crippling the convoys meant to deliver reinforcements. One pilot from the 3rd Bombardment Group later recalled, "We landed where no sane man would try to land. Steel mats half buried in mud, trucks parked like barriers, and you could still see engineers hammering while your wheels hit the ground." But it worked. It always worked. Every flight was a calculated risk. The makeshift roads were short, often less than 4,000 feet, forcing pilots to rely on instinct and timing. Aircraft took off 2 at a time, engines roaring at full throttle before their wheels even left the ground. If one stalled, there was no margin for error. But the reward was immense. With each mission launched from those improvised bases, the Americans tightened their grip over the Philippines. The Japanese air presence dwindled until, by mid-November, their sorties were reduced to sporadic attacks. Many of them kamikaze missions born of desperation rather than strategy. On the ground, the contrast between the two sides deepened. The Americans operated from crude but abundant fields. The Japanese were trapped on fixed, crumbling airbases, bombed daily by aircraft, taking off from roads their own intelligence had dismissed as unusable. At Clark Field on Luzon, Japanese mechanics struggled to keep their fighters operational. Fuel had to be siphoned by hand from 55-gallon drums. Tires were patched with rags. Every landing risked collapse. Every takeoff consumed the last of a precious reserve. In one report, a Japanese commander lamented, "Our bases are static graves. The enemy's airfields multiply like ants." Back on Leyte, the human cost of this relentless pace was steep. Engineers worked around the clock. Disease spread, malaria, dysentery, exhaustion. When ammunition trucks exploded during bombing raids, men returned to the smoldering wreckage to rebuild before dawn. The fields were not only runways, they were cemeteries of progress, littered with burned steel and broken tools. But morale held, sustained by a shared conviction that every plank laid, every foot of ground leveled, pushed the war closer to its end. There were no speeches, no banners, no applause. Just the rhythm of hammers on steel and the rising chorus of engines above. By December, the Americans were operating from over a dozen functional airstrips across Leyte and Samar, many of them built in less than a week. This web of forward bases allowed them to project air power deep into Luzon, isolating Japanese garrisons and clearing the way for the next invasion. Japan's response came too late and too fractured to matter. Raids on the new airstrips were brave, but futile. Each time an American field was bombed, it was operational again within hours. The Japanese pilots who survived these attacks returned to find their own bases cratered and fuel exhausted. The psychological shift was irreversible. For the first time, the Japanese High Command began to understand that the war's center of gravity had changed. No longer did victory hinge on control of the sea alone. It now depended on who could control the air, and that, in turn, depended on who could build faster than the enemy could destroy. At Leyte, the Americans had mastered that cycle. They no longer needed to seize perfect airfields. They made their own perfection out of imperfection. Each new landing, each roar of wheels on rough metal, was another act of defiance against the old order of warfare. The jungle itself seemed to yield to this rhythm, as if acknowledging a new master. When the U.S. invasion of Luzon began in January 1945, the lesson of Leyte had already reshaped strategy. Mobile engineering units now moved in the first wave of landings alongside infantry. The Americans no longer came to capture bases. They came to create them. And the Japanese pilots, who had once looked down in disbelief, watching fighters land on roads that should have been death traps, now understood that their empire's final defeat would not come only from bombs or bullets. It would come from a kind of genius they had never imagined, the genius of adaptation. When the dust settled over Leyte, the island no longer looked like the place where Japan had once ruled the air. It was a scarred expanse of steel, mud, and wreckage. Yet from it rose a new empire of flight. The numbers told the story as brutally as any battlefield could. In just 6 weeks, American engineers had constructed 13 operational airstrips across Leyte and Samar. From these, more than 1,500 aircraft sorties were flown every day by the end of November. Japan, once master of the Pacific skies, managed only a fraction of that. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Air Force could field barely 150 operational aircraft across the entire Philippine theater, and fewer each week. The imbalance was staggering. What Japan had once built in years, an archipelago of fortified air bases, the Americans had recreated in months, sometimes in days. For the U.S., the immediate outcome was victory on the ground and in the sky. The new airstrips provided constant cover for advancing infantry, close support for tank battalions, and reconnaissance over the entire island chain. They made possible the destruction of Japan's shipping lanes in Ormoc Bay, cutting off reinforcements and starving Japanese ground forces trapped on Leyte. By December, the island's liberation was all but assured. Yet, for every foot of runway laid, there was a price, one measured in sweat, exhaustion, and blood. The engineers, those unsung builders of the war, paid dearly. On Leyte alone, more than 600 casualties were recorded among aviation engineer units, men killed or wounded by artillery, air raids, disease, and accidents. Many died with shovels still in hand. Their graves often stood just yards from the runways they had finished. One report from the 850th Battalion described the cost bluntly. Our casualties were heavy, but the work never stopped. We buried our dead beside the strip, covered them with tarps, and went back to laying steel. The planes had to land. That was the only thing that mattered. For pilots, the danger never ended, even after the fight for the skies had been won. The improvised runways that gave them mobility also tested every ounce of their skill. Tires blew out on landing, mud swallowed aircraft whole. B-25s skidded off the ends of half-finished roads, crashing into tree lines or ditches. Every mission was a contest against chance. But the pilots understood what was at stake. If they could hold the skies over Leyte, the rest of the Philippines would follow. And behind them, always, were the engineers who kept those fragile lifelines open, patching, welding, and rebuilding between sorties. For the Japanese, the cost was total. Their fleet, drawn into the trap at Leyte Gulf, suffered one of the worst naval defeats in history. The super battleship Musashi lay at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea, torn apart by airstrikes launched from American carriers and, soon after, from the very fields on Leyte the Japanese had believed unusable. Their air groups, battered by attrition, dwindled to nothing. By the end of November, Japan's ability to contest the skies over the Philippines had collapsed completely. The last remnants of the Imperial Army on Leyte were cut off, surrounded, and isolated. Thousands died in the jungles, victims not only of American firepower, but of hunger and disease. Casualties of a strategy that had promised victory through delay, and instead delivered annihilation through stagnation. When the island finally fell in December 1944, it was more than a military defeat. It was a revelation. Japan had built its empire on the assumption that its enemies would move slowly, bound by logistics, weather, and terrain. Leyte proved the opposite, that the Americans could conquer not just land and sea, but time itself. Every steel plank, every improvised runway, had been a challenge to Japan's understanding of warfare. And by the end of Leyte, that challenge had become an answer. For the Japanese, Leyte was more than a defeat. It was disillusionment. Every pilot, every officer who had watched those American planes rise from muddy roads and broken fields carried home the same haunting truth. Their empire had been outthought. In the aftermath, fragments of intercepted Japanese communications revealed disbelief bordering on despair. One air officer on Luzon reported bitterly, "They land on roads. They build where we destroy. Every strike we make, they answer by creating more." The Japanese command could not adjust fast enough to this new kind of war. Their engineers lacked the equipment to replicate what the Americans had done. Heavy machinery was scarce, fuel scarcer still. Every Japanese airfield that was bombed became a graveyard of twisted metal and abandoned hopes. The psychological toll on Japan's airmen was devastating. Once, the Zero pilots had ruled the Pacific with unmatched skill. They had fought over Wake, Rabaul, and the Coral Sea as masters of precision and discipline. Now, they faced an enemy that seemed untouchable, an enemy that could rebuild faster than they could destroy. Those who survived the Leyte campaign spoke later of helplessness, how the Americans would level a field in days, and within hours, swarms of bombers would rise from it to strike again. The sense of invincibility that had fueled Japan's early victories vanished into the mud of the Philippines. For the United States, the victory came with its own form of exhaustion. Every success demanded human endurance that defied reason. Engineers fought the terrain as fiercely as they fought the enemy. Tropical disease struck thousands. Fatigue crippled entire units. The air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and decay. Yet through that exhaustion came a quiet pride, the kind born of necessity, not glory. Men who had never carried rifles could look up and see planes overhead, knowing that their labor kept them aloft. Each takeoff was an act of faith repaid. Strategically, Leyte became the hinge upon which the Pacific War turned. It gave the Allies a springboard for the final assault on Luzon, Okinawa, and ultimately Japan itself. From the improvised fields of Leyte, bombers could now reach every major Japanese stronghold in the Philippines. The empire's defensive perimeter collapsed island by island, its lines of communication shredded. When General MacArthur declared Leyte secured, he knew that Japan's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. The Americans had demonstrated that they could create power anywhere, without infrastructure, without pause, without permission. This victory came at a cost counted not just in casualties, but in transformation. The Pacific War was no longer defined by the clash of fleets or the bravery of individual pilots. It was now a war of systems, of logistics, construction, and endurance. A war won by men who built faster than their enemies could comprehend. Japan's surviving commanders saw it clearly. They wrote after the war that their greatest failure had not been courage, nor weaponry, but imagination. They had prepared for the war they knew, a war of battleships and bases, while the Americans had fought the war that was coming, mobile, industrial, and mercilessly efficient. By the close of 1944, the once dreaded Rising Sun squadrons were shadows of themselves. Young pilots, many barely trained, were sent on one-way missions. Kamikaze attacks born of desperation rather than doctrine. They struck the very airstrips that had humiliated their superiors, diving into steel and fire with the last remnants of Japan's will. But it was too late. The fields they tried to destroy were rebuilt in hours. The empire that had once dreamed of eternal conquest now fought only to delay the inevitable. For every zero that burned in the sky, another American plane rose from a road that had never been meant for flight. The lesson of Leyte was carved not in marble, but in mud and steel. That victory belongs to those who refuse to stop building, even in the middle of destruction. The victory at Leyte was not just a triumph of arms. It was the unveiling of a new kind of warfare. In its aftermath, the lessons learned there rippled through every level of Allied strategy. For the United States, Leyte proved beyond doubt that mobility and construction could replace occupation and fortification as the backbone of modern war. No longer did armies wait for infrastructure. They created it, anywhere, under fire, and with astonishing speed. This doctrine, tested on the beaches of the Philippines, reshaped the entire Pacific campaign. When the invasion of Luzon began in January 1945, engineering units landed in the first assault wave. Before the last Japanese stronghold on Leyte had even fallen, bulldozers were already moving north. Within days of securing Lingayen Gulf, American fighters were landing on new forward strips built by the same process that had stunned the Japanese weeks earlier. The formula was brutally efficient. Seize the beach, build the airfield, dominate the sky, advance again. Every island captured became a stepping stone for the next, and every airstrip, no matter how makeshift, became a launchpad of overwhelming force. The Japanese Empire, once stretched across 3,000 miles of ocean, now found itself surrounded by enemy bases that had materialized from the Earth itself. Every attempt to regroup met the same outcome. By the time their reinforcements arrived, the Americans had already built a new field closer to their target. At the Allied command level, Leyte's lesson was codified into doctrine. In 1945, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers published detailed studies on rapid airfield construction in forward zones. The findings were clear. Speed of construction could decide the outcome of campaigns as surely as the number of divisions engaged. From then on, every major invasion plan, from Luzon to Okinawa, began not with the question, where can we land, but where can we build? The air war itself was transformed. Aircraft no longer needed vast permanent installations to operate effectively. With PSP, pierced steel planking, and mobile maintenance units, they could leapfrog across the Pacific faster than Japan could react. This shift erased the traditional boundaries between engineering, logistics, and combat. They were now one and the same, a seamless chain of creation and destruction. In Japan, the fallout was intellectual as well as strategic. The Imperial General Staff, reviewing the defeat, concluded that they had underestimated the enemy's industrial adaptability. One post-war analysis from the Japanese Army Engineering Bureau admitted, the American method of field construction turned natural obstacles into allies. We had no equivalent capacity. Our doctrine remained static. Theirs evolved with every campaign. It was a rare moment of candor, a recognition that innovation, not just firepower, had undone them. The ethical and legal implications, meanwhile, emerged in quieter tones. For the Americans, Leyte and the subsequent Philippines campaign revealed the staggering human toll of building war at such a pace. The Seabees and Army engineers were celebrated as heroes, yet their casualty rates rivaled those of frontline infantry in some operations. They had no Geneva protection as combatants, classified as construction troops, yet killed under bombardment. Their contribution blurred the moral boundary between soldier and laborer. In later years, U.S. military law and policy would change because of them. By the Korean War, combat engineers were recognized as fully armed, fully protected units under international law, a legacy born from the mud and danger of Leyte. Strategically, the aftermath of Leyte also altered Allied planning for the eventual invasion of Japan. The new doctrine of improvised airfields made it unnecessary to seize every island. Instead, planners focused only on those large enough to sustain temporary bases. This approach saved months and countless lives, narrowing the campaign's focus to Okinawa and, if necessary, Kyushu. Even the atomic bomb project, still secret at the time, benefited from Leyte's logistics. The construction speed demonstrated in the Philippines gave Allied commanders confidence that the massive infrastructure required for bomber staging, the runways at Tinian and Saipan, could be built. In time for operations against Japan's home islands, Leyte, in short, had changed the rhythm of war. For Japan, the defeat triggered a collapse of strategic coherence. By early 1945, Japanese commanders had abandoned coordinated defense. They no longer spoke of victory, only of delay. The realization that the enemy could build an airfield in days, anywhere, stripped them of hope. It was the end of initiative, the death of momentum. At home, the shock rippled through Tokyo's leadership. Reports describing enemy aviation using farm roads as bases were read aloud in war councils. Senior officers dismissed them at first as exaggerated propaganda, but younger staffers knew better. They had seen the reconnaissance photos. They understood what it meant. The Americans were fighting a war that Japan had never prepared for, a war of endless motion. As the empire shrank and air superiority vanished, a grim logic took hold within Japan's command circles. If the Americans could build everywhere, then Japan could defend nowhere. The only answer left was sacrifice, the kamikaze. Those suicide attacks, often romanticized later as acts of divine patriotism, were in reality a desperate admission of technological and logistical defeat. When your enemy can rebuild faster than you can resist, heroism becomes the only weapon left. But the Americans did not fight for symbols. They fought for systems. Every new road-turned-runway was another thread in a vast industrial web that reached back to California, Kansas, and Detroit. A war fought as much by welders and machinists as by soldiers. By war's end, the doctrine of rapid construction had become permanent. It shaped NATO's Cold War policies, the U.S. Air Force's base network, and the Marine Corps' expeditionary philosophy. The idea that mobility is victory, born in the mud of Leyte, would echo through every conflict that followed. In legal terms, Leyte also revealed the blurred lines of modern total war. Airfields were no longer neutral terrain or simple infrastructure. They were weapons, targets as critical as ships or cities. The Hague Conventions of earlier decades had not imagined bulldozers building runways under shell fire. The Pacific War forced the world to accept a new truth. Technology had erased the front line. And so, while nations debated the morality of bombing, few noticed the quiet revolution that had already occurred. The transformation of warfare from static to dynamic, from fortified to fluid. The Japanese pilots who once stared down in disbelief at American planes landing on roads had witnessed more than an enemy's ingenuity. They had seen the future. A world where power lay not in possession, but in creation. When the war ended in 1945, Leyte's runways were already fading under the jungle's return. Grass crept through the seams of the steel planking. The roar of engines gave way to silence. But the legacy of those makeshift roads would outlive the war that created them. The lessons born in the mud of the Philippines redefined how the world thought about power, preparation, and possibility. For the United States, the success of Laty's improvised airfields became a blueprint for modern expeditionary warfare. It proved that dominance did not come from vast fortresses or massive bases, but from agility, speed, and adaptation. Within months, American military planners rewrote their doctrines. By 1947, when the U.S. Air Force became an independent branch, its early field manuals quoted the findings from Laty directly. Air superiority rests not only on air crews and machines, but on the ability to create the ground from which they rise. This idea that engineering could equal firepower became the silent foundation of the Cold War. The Air Force built global networks of temporary and permanent bases designed to be raised or rebuilt in days, not weeks. Across Europe, Asia, and later the Middle East, that philosophy endured. The power to arrive anywhere, build anywhere, fight anywhere. Every modern air campaign, from Korea to Vietnam, from Desert Storm to humanitarian missions in remote corners of the world, carries Laty's signature. Rapid runway repair, modular construction, portable refueling, mobile command, all trace their lineage to that moment when American engineers first landed in the Philippines and turned broken roads into lifelines. It was not just a military revolution, it was a philosophical one. The Pacific Campaign taught that flexibility could defeat perfection, that innovation mattered more than doctrine, that the most dangerous enemy is the one who can change faster than you can react. Japan learned this lesson painfully, but profoundly. After the war, its reconstruction mirrored the very principle that had defeated it. Industry, technology, and design became the nation's new weapons. The same meticulous precision once used for Zero fighters was reborn in factories producing machines of peace, automobiles, cameras, electronics, each built with an adaptability once absent from its war plans. In this, history came full circle. The nation that had fallen behind because it clung to rigid systems rose again by embracing innovation itself. Japan's post-war engineers, many veterans of the imperial forces, helped create one of the most advanced industrial societies in the world. The ghost of Laty whispered behind that transformation, a reminder that the ability to build anew is the truest form of strength. For America, the legacy was equally deep but different. The triumph of ingenuity over rigidity became part of its national story. The idea that no obstacle is final if you can adapt faster than the problem changes. From the CB's motto, "Can do," grew a cultural ethos that still defines American engineering, exploration, and even technology today. But there was another, quieter lesson, one written not in steel, but in sacrifice. Those who built the roads, laid the planks, and leveled the ground paid a price that history rarely recounts. Their work turned the tide of battle, yet their names often disappeared beneath the larger stories of generals and admirals. They fought not with rifles, but with tools. Their victories were measured not in territories taken, but in hours saved, in the time they denied to the enemy. When veterans of the 850th Engineer Battalion gathered after the war, one officer said, "We didn't win by killing faster. We won by building faster." That's what broke Japan. That single sentence captured the soul of Laty's legacy. It was not about destruction. It was about creation under fire. Not about overpowering an enemy, but about outthinking him. The transformation of warfare that began on those muddy runways reshaped how nations viewed progress itself. Technology, logistics, and imagination became as decisive as courage. The bulldozer and the bomber had become equals on the battlefield. In the decades that followed, this philosophy continued to evolve. Nations began to understand that infrastructure, the ability to move, supply, and rebuild, was the lifeblood of security. Modern armies would come to see engineers not as support, but as the vanguard, and beneath all of it lay a simple truth that Leahy had revealed in the harshest way possible. War favors the side that adapts first, and punishes the one that waits for conditions to be perfect. By the time the last rusted sheets of pierced steel planking were pulled from the Philippine soil, the world had already changed. The road had become the runway, the field had become the fortress, and from that transformation, a new age of warfare and a new vision of human capability was born. The men who built those runways never called themselves heroes. They were builders, improvisers, problem solvers. But in the end, it was their quiet, relentless creativity that carried a nation across the Pacific and taught the world that innovation, not size, decides the future. Every great victory gathers myths around it. Stories simplified, exaggerated, or softened with time. Leahy's miracle of the makeshift airfields is no exception. But the truth, though less glamorous, is far more extraordinary. Myth number 1. The Americans used captured Japanese airfields. In truth, almost none of the operational strips on Leahy were captured intact. Japanese demolitions and Allied bombardments left them cratered and useless. What shocked Japan's pilots was not that Americans had seized their bases, but that they built new ones on swampy farmland and narrow provincial roads while the fighting still raged. Leahy's first functioning airstrips were American creations, not inheritances. Myth number 2. Improvised airfields were temporary stopgaps. They were far more than that. Many of the temporary fields operated for months, handling hundreds of sorties daily. Pierced steel planking, the modular steel matting used on Leahy, proved so durable that entire sections remained in use into the 1950s. These makeshift runways became models for post-war expeditionary bases, influencing every major U.S. air campaign that followed. Myth number 3. Japan's defeat at Leahy was purely naval. While the Battle of Leyte Gulf destroyed much of Japan's remaining fleet, the real collapse came from the air. When American engineers built operational airstrips within days of landing, Japan lost control of the skies. Without air cover, their naval counterattack was blind. Without resupply, their ground forces were trapped. The war in the Philippines was decided not just by ships at sea, but by bulldozers on land. History often remembers the thunder, the great battles, the explosions, the fleets in flames, but beneath that noise lies the hum of unseen labor. The engineers, mechanics, and builders who turned mud into metal and changed the course of the war. The truth of Leahy is not about luck or miracle. It is about design, persistence, and the refusal to be limited by the landscape. In the end, that is what shocked Japan's pilots most. Not that the Americans could land on roads, but that they had imagined it was possible in the first place. Because in war, as in history, the power to imagine and to build is what endures when everything else falls away.